Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise with a formal mission. That mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. That is our formal purpose. We go about our work in many different ways. We try to get the attention of the media sometimes. We try to get the attention of thought leaders and commentators sometimes, and of course, politicians. And in the UK, with us having a parliamentary democracy, it's very important that we do that because our elected representatives are in a really good place to help make sure that the financial sector behaves the way that it should, which we would define as serving society properly. Over the years, the Transparency Task Force has campaigned for 3 inquiries to be opened. The first was about the need for greater transparency on costs and charges in investments. We campaigned for that via a letter to Frank Field MP, rest in peace, lovely guy, really lovely guy. And Frank Field and his Work and Pensions Select Committee graciously opened that inquiry, and we were very active participants in it. We were over the moon about that, our first ever inquiry. The second was the same committee, the Work and Pensions Select Committee, this time to Stephen Timms, or I should now say Sir Stephen Timms MP. That inquiry was about pension scams, a horrific topic, as I think some of you know. And that inquiry lasted for about 5 months. We were really, really heavily involved with contributing to it. Like the first inquiry, we were able to give evidence in person in Parliament. Because of the pandemic, it was on Zoom, if I remember rightly. And we even recorded some video testimonies of various witnesses. And a few months ago, we thought we'd have a go at getting another one opened, which we did. We did that, and we're really pleased with how it went. In some ways, it's probably our best ever executed inquiry. The way that it worked was we organised a letter that we sent to Harriet Baldwin MP. Oops, amazing. Here it is. Harriet Baldwin MP, the chair of the Select Committee, dated the 24th of May. And what the letter basically says is, dear Ms. Baldwin, for lots of sensible reasons, can you please reopen the inquiry you previously ran on SME finance, particularly because we are rather concerned about the workings of the Business Banking Resolution Service and related matters. I'll put a link to this in the chat. And the letter sets out quite reasonably and quite sensibly why we thought an inquiry would be useful. And it was very well written. One of our members, Mark Bishop, played a big part in writing this. And we were very pleased when other organisations were happy to show support for it as well. In particular, SME Alliance, Federation of Small Business, BBRS Ineligible, the APPG on Fair Business Banking, Bank Confidential, the APPG on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services, which is the one that the TTF is a secretariat for, and the APPG on Debt and Personal Finance. In addition to those organisations co-signing our letter, 2 members of the BBRS's SME liaison panel also co-signed it. Mark Bishop, who I just mentioned, helped to write the letter, and Nish Kotecha. Significant that those 2 gentlemen co-signed the letter because they were on the SME liaison panel. And then we thought we'd try and get some politicians to sign the letter as well. And we got more than we hoped for. In fact, we got much more than we hoped for, which suggests to me that this issue of SME finance and the Business Banking Resolution Service and making sure that business people get properly treated by the banks is a major public interest issue. A major public interest issue. So we were over the moon with the amount of support MPs. And in addition to that, we also got some members of the House of Lords showing their support as well. Some of our overseas members showed their support too. And then we have a very, very long list here of individuals, most of whom, not all, but most of whom are victims of misconduct themselves, misconduct by the banks. as you can see here. I'll scroll quite quickly because, as you can see, this is a very, very long list. So when it was announced a little while ago that the Treasury Committee had decided to open an inquiry on SME finance, we were absolutely over the moon. And I would generally like us to stop and pause here for a moment, because as a campaign organisation, it's really important every now and then to kind of stop and reflect on what you're doing and the little mini victories that you've managed to achieve, because these little victories add up to something. They help build momentum, they help raise awareness of the things that we want to talk about and that we want to actually draw attention to. So I'd like us at the moment to put our hands together for everybody that helped write the letter, the organisations that were the front runners in co-signing it, including, for example, the Federation of Small Business, represented here today by Tony Barron, and everybody else that participated in signing the letter, be they MPs, lords, or ordinary folks, some have been very sadly, in fact, most of whom very sadly were victims of banking misconduct of one kind or another. It really is a worryingly long list, isn't it? A worryingly long list of people who've been harmed by the banks. And of course, the reality is the list that you've just seen of banking misconduct victims is a tiny, tiny percentage of the thousands and thousands of people who have in some way been let down by, missold by, cheated by, abused by, exploited by the banks. Choose whatever word you want to describe that. So quite literally, before we do anything else, can I please invite you to join me in putting our hands together for everybody that contributed to writing the letter, co-signing the letter, encouraging other people to co-sign the letter, and also please to the Treasury Committee itself for basically listening to what we asked for and opening the inquiry. Always worth doing that. Always worth doing that, and always worth reflecting on the many achievements that a campaign group like ours can sometimes achieve. What we're going to do now, folks, is we're going to take a look at the Treasury Committee's website, in particular the bit that talks about the inquiry, because we want everybody that wants to, only do it if you want to, but we want everybody that wants to take time to respond to the inquiry as an individual, a business owner, as well as, if you wish to help us, as well as to contribute to TTF's own response as well. So again, I'm going to share my screen. I think I can do it this way. Yeah, okay. So I'll put a link to this web page in a minute. It's basically the web page for the Treasury Committee's inquiry on SME finance. And there are different sections to it, okay? It's actually a very, very far-reaching consultation. There's a section all about industry issues. Frankly, we probably won't be writing a single word in response to any of the issues that are industry issues. It's not our kind of area of expertise, and there are other organisations that are far, far better equipped and far more knowledgeable about the issues that are there. There definitely are some in the regulatory issues section, which we'll look at in a minute. And there might be one or two that we might touch on in the government policy issues, but our main area of attention is going to be the regulatory issues. Some of the questions are far, far more relevant to us than others, and I'll try to draw that distinction as we go. The first question is, do SMEs have adequate and appropriate access to a complaints procedure when in dispute with a bank or lender? That question is definitely very relevant. Do SMEs have adequate and appropriate access to a complaints procedure when in dispute with a bank or lender? I think the answer is no, they don't. But it may well be that some of you have got particular thoughts around that you can bring to life during the session. Because the session's being recorded, I'm going to be going over it afterwards and kind of forensically piecing together all the comments that you ladies and gentlemen want to make. And to the best of my ability, working with whoever volunteers to help me, I'll be sort of threading the narrative that you provide into the response. The next question, how effective has the Lending Standards Board standards of lending practice been? I think that's kind of outside our territory. But if anybody has a really strong opinion on that, we can look to include things. The next bit's very, very important, I would suggest. How well does the Financial Ombudsman Service work for small business complaints? The next, is the FOS's existing role in SME finance appropriate? If not, how should it be changed? Very, very importantly, and where I think probably, I'm kind of guessing folks, 80% of TTF's response is going to be around this question: how effective has the Business Banking Resolution Service been, and what lessons can be learned from it? The way that that question's been written, I think, gives us license to include pretty much anything we want about the BBRS, because somehow we can kind of massage it into being about the BBRS's effectiveness and what lessons can be learned from it. There's so much that can be put into that second section. So whilst there is this specific question, in reality, TTF's response is going to be quite far-reaching in terms of how we respond to that question. Next one is this, and again, there may be some of you have specific thoughts on this. It's not certainly not something in my head. Should SMEs have the same level of consumer protection and deposit insurance limits as retail customers? Let's put an answer to that. I don't know what it is, but let's put an answer to it. The next, should commercial lending to SMEs be brought into the regulatory perimeter? I think that's a really big and important question. My hunch is yes, it should. Regulated is better than unregulated when it comes to consumer protection. But of course, we all know that regulated doesn't necessarily mean well regulated. There's a difference between regulated and well regulated. But let's put something to that as well. The last one on this list is, I don't have a clue about it at all. What impact will the PRA's proposed Basel 3.1 capital requirements framework, and in particular, the proposed removal of the SME support factor, have on SMEs in the context of
just so you're aware, Andy, it's a classic example of, if we were still in Europe is going to keep the SME 75% risk weighting, but the PRA has decided to follow the purer Basel committee and has decided to go for a higher risk weighting of 100%. So basically it means banks will have to hold more capital to lend to SMEs, which actually makes SME lending less attractive. So actually it's a classic own goal, but actually there's nothing the government can do about it because the PRA is independent. So I mean, we can complain as much as we like, but the PRA doesn't do what it's told. So yeah.
Thank you, Ian. Ladies and gentlemen, could I please invite you to put your hands together for applauding Mr. Tyler for volunteering to write a couple of paragraphs?
All right, I will. It's very easy. I mean, it's actually one of the very few areas where probably consumers and banks' interests are aligned.
Okay.
So,
thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Ian. And remember, it's on tape. Thanks for volunteering, sir. Appreciate it. The next section on government policy issues. We'll go through them just so you know what's there. Should the government do more to enhance SME access to finance? And if so, what? What has the impact of the COVID bounce-back loan schemes, followed by the recovery loan schemes, been on SME finance? And the next bit is, in the US, the Treasury approved a fund, State Small Business Credit Initiative, for incentivizing and supporting underserved businesses. Does the UK need similar provisions? And lastly, how useful is the British Business Bank? Does its finance hub improve SME access to finance? So those are the questions. So we might do a teeny tiny bit in the third section. We'll be doing loads and loads in the middle section about regulatory issues, including, of course, the bit about the BBRS. And might do a little bit. We'll probably almost completely stay away from the industry issues. But if anybody's got thoughts they really, really want to include, then there's no reason why we shouldn't, as long as the views are in keeping with TTF's overall views about protecting consumers from harm. While I'm on this page, I want to sort of show you the way the process works, okay? Particularly for those of you who are inclined, and I do encourage it, to put in your own responses. And remember, you don't need to respond to all of it. You can just specify the bits you're responding to. And please note, the deadline is now 5 o'clock on the 1st of September. It was the 13th of August. I've got no idea why it changed, but I'm very, very glad that it did, because it's bought us a bit more time. So 5 o'clock on the 1st of September. Okay. The process, consultations tend to have different processes. For this particular one, you've basically got to upload the document you want to submit. It says it can be over 3,000 words. I've got a feeling ours will be. But if it is over 3,000 words, you need to include a short summary as well. Fair enough, we can do that. And you upload your evidence. The file you upload must be less than 25 megabytes, be a single document. We'll probably use a Word document and contain no logos. So we'll be mindful of that. There's some notes there about what they then do, and then you continue, and then you basically go through a very simple question set so they can kind of categorize the respondent, make sure that the right person's name's in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you proceed through the process, and then you eventually get to a bit where you upload the document. So it's pretty user-friendly. Now, I'm going to pause there before we go to the next part of this conversation, just to check in. Does anybody have any kind of questions at front of mind that you're itching to ask, or comments that you're itching to make before we go any further? Okay, so far, so good. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you a document that we already have that contains loads and loads of narrative around the business banking resolution service. This is a document that was produced some months ago for a different purpose. There's no real need for me to explain what that different purpose was, but it contains lots and lots and lots of relevant content about the BBRS. I'm going to be walking you through the sections in the document just so that you know the topics where we're already geared up to make comments about, because I'm particularly keen to make sure that we understand any areas that our current document doesn't yet have in it that you think we should cover, right? So I'm going to talk for about 5-10 minutes going through it. We're then going to pause, and I'm going to invite you to talk to me about any other topics that you think should be in there. When you talk about those topics, I'll invite you to elaborate so I really understand what they are, so that we can then use the recording of this event and the narrative you give us as a basis for putting in those thoughts into it. Okay, I hope that's all pretty clear. And then we'll open the conversation up more widely. So again, I'm going to share my screen to do this. And I'm going to go to, where are you? I'm going to go to here. So I'll go to the beginning of it. This thing is currently about 42 pages. There's probably going to be bits I chop out or edit right down. And there's probably going to be bits that we kind of elaborate and big up a little bit more. Some of it is not directly relevant to the narrative in the consultation. We can squeeze those out or just minimize them, etc. But anyway, back to the thing. Here it is. Obviously, we'll be taking the logos out. There's some waffle about the TTF. There's some words about this document really matters. There's some background for BBRS. There's a section where we basically talk about the general commentary about the BBRS. You can see what we say there. And then we move on to this. There are 5 major problems that the BBRS has. There's a bit about the lack of independence. We elaborate on that point later in the document. There's a bit about the eligibility criteria problem, where we basically say the criteria is too strict, and because of that, it won't work. There's a bit about the trust and confidence problem. This is where the BBRS had an objective to help rebuild trust and confidence between banks and businesses, but it, we believe, hasn't done that. There's a bit here about the consequential reputational damage problem. What we mean here is, because the BBRS hasn't done its job to rebuild trust and confidence between banks and businesses, the damage of the sector has persisted. Many businesses don't think highly of the banking sector. And there's a bit here about what we call the opportunity cost problem, where we basically say that for several years, a whole load of time has been wasted. The can is effectively being kicked down the road because the BBRS hasn't been effective. We've talked in a bit more detail about some of the issues in this section called an overview of the key issues as reported by many. So it's another level of detail on some of the issues. Doesn't really matter what it is because it's just general commentary. There's a whole section about critical media coverage, critical as in, you know, it's negative, it's bad. There's loads of that. We can add a few more to it because it's been a few months since that was done. We've got them all in there. Similarly, we'll be adding in, I must remember to do this, we'll be adding in links to the reports used at the recent Westminster Hall debate, because there was a very good piece of preparatory briefing documents produced by the folks who ran that debate, and there's a link to the Hansard we can include, and there's a link to the video recording itself. There's a bit about the establishment of the BBRS. We'll probably change some of the order of this around because maybe the establishment bit should be early on. Who knows? We'll worry about that later. There's commentary around the persistent reasons for concern. Comments, for example, by people such as Kevin Hollinrake MP and others. And there's a section which I think is very important. Expectations about the BBRS set by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is the bit where the letter to UK Finance basically says, we expect this is going to do a good job of sorting these problems out. And there's a particular paragraph here that's very, very important, I think. If it transpires that the scheme is not bringing resolution to a meaningful number of complaints, and as such is not going to achieve its objective of bringing closure to past complaints, then I would expect there to be further discussions around the scope of and eligibility for the backward-looking scheme. We also have expectations set by other stakeholders. There's a really interesting bit here relating to John Glenn. I'll just go to this very, very quickly. So this is in 11th of March 2021, a question from Christine Jardine MP, who's a Liberal Democrat. So I'll just click on this link. It should take us to where we want it to go. So Christine Jardine asks this question. I'll read it out in case you can't see it. It says, to ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer with reference to the BBRS, if he will take steps to encourage adoption of the BBRS by the banks, resolve outstanding terms of reference and eligibility criteria, finalise and publish the BBRS process to deliver service specified by terms of reference. And this is the bit I'm particularly interested in. Demonstrate the independence of the BBRS and enable the BBRS to resolve historical complaints. So that was Christine Jardine's question. And John Glenn answered it. The answer is quite interesting because I'll just refer to the last part of it. Beyond that high level guidance, I would like to stress the BBRS has been set up as an independent, non-governmental body. And this independence is vital to its role. Its credibility, authority and value to SMEs would be undermined if it were possible for the government to intervene in such matters. I think that's a really, really interesting question because effectively, John Glenn talks about the importance of it being independent. And then he adds a bit onto the end of the sentence where he's effectively linking the independence of the BBRS to independence from government. But the question I'll put out there, we can talk about this later, folks, is whether the use of the word independence relates to more than just independence from government. Should it have been independence from the banks? We'll leave that one hanging there and we'll come back to it a little bit later. But that's what I mean by commentary from others in terms of setting the expectation. The narrative is that the expectation was set that the BBRS would be independent. Scrolling on, we move on now to some very well-sourced commentary. We have Andy Candy to thank for this. In fact, I think Andy's with us. Can we please once again put our hands together for Andy Candy, who's done a brilliant job over many months to source previously unfindable archive material, including the transcripts of the webinars and stuff that actually happened. It's rather miraculous that we've got access to hard records of what was said at the various meetings. So the one on 28th of May 2020 webinar, we've got commentary here between John McLeod and Alexander Marks. For those of you that want access to this document, by the way, I should have said this earlier, when we circulate the notes tomorrow, we'll ask you, do you want access to the document so you can chip into it and help us develop it? So you'll be able to look at this later if you want to. There's also on 4th of June 2020, more commentary between John McLeod and Alexander Marks, etc., etc. And all this commentary adds to the expectations that people had when they were thinking about whether to use the BBRS or not. And there's all sorts of links here. Again, we've got Andy Canny to thank for all that, that take us to hard evidence of about what was actually being said. Because each one of these is a source of evidence. So, for example, if I just click on one of them here, missing was, I've got no idea what's going to show us, but it's going to show us something. This is about routes to resolution. So it's basically that the full narrative is in there and links to that. So it's all accessible, and there's a video, etc., etc., etc. So that's very, very good. Thank you very much indeed again, Mr. Candy. We then got a really, really important piece. I won't mention the names, but there's a couple of guys who've been absolutely heroic around the discovery of the bank appointed member. Those of you who know who those folks are will know who those folks are that I'm talking about. Discovering the bank appointed member, which is such a significant thing to discover. For those of you that may not know, the bank appointed member is the entity created and run by the banks that effectively controlled it. Here we go. The question, is the bank appointed member a person of significant control? There's some pretty detailed narrative around that. It talks about who the actual members of the bank appointed member are. I say are, I should say were. It might be that they've changed since then. This is a bit out of date, so I'll have to fact check that in due course. But you'll see that they include people who are at the various banks. There's one at Lloyds Bank here, Santander, Barclays, HSBC, NatWest, Virgin Money, Danske. The point, of course, being that if the bank appointed member was ultimately the person of significant control for the BBRS, then how can the claim that the BBRS is independent, how can that be substantiated? It's a very, very important discovery. There's also a piece here about whether the BBRS is a distinct enterprise. This is basically about the idea that perhaps the BBRS isn't actually significantly different to the banks themselves. That's what that's all about. A very important bit here, Stephen Barker's rather good at this point. Was the FCA correct to effectively subcontract to the BBRS in the first place? This is about the big question, which is, was it right for the regulator to step aside and allow the banking industry to put forward a bank-run and bank-led redress scheme that was bank-controlled? Surely that would be a recipe for disaster, folks, one might think. So was the FCA right to do that? There's a bit about what has the BBRS spent. The numbers have changed, but when we put this together, it was 32 million. I think the number's gone up a fair bit since then. Obviously, the subtext is it hasn't really delivered very good value for money, has it? I think it's something like £2 million paid out and £40 million spent. We can all do the maths on that. What has the BBRS achieved in terms of cases successfully resolved? Again, we need to update the numbers. There's a piece around what we're calling the mysteries of the application of the eligibility criteria. What we mean there by the mysteries is the apparent difference between how the eligibility criteria could, we would say, should have been applied and how it actually was applied. And as I think many of you know, the eligibility criteria is remarkably important in all of this. Some stuff about boundary and concessionary cases and why they're so problematic. And why have there been so many resignations? That's a really legitimate question. Connected to this question around, was there something wrong with the BBRS? Did these folks leave because they weren't completely comfortable with it? There's an email trail here that I've had permission to share. It's an email trail between Andy Keats of SME Alliance, who's been on the SME liaison panel. It's an email trail between Andy Keats and the BBRS. And what it basically shows is quite long. It basically shows that the narrative that the BBRS sometimes put forward, which is that all decisions made were made in support of, or were supported by all the SME representatives, this email exchange would rather challenge that narrative. So I think it's an important email exchange that we've included as a bit of collateral to compete with the idea that everything was hunky-dory amongst the people representing the SMEs. This narrative most certainly shows that it was not the case, and therefore it's quite powerful. That's important because we want to articulate to the Treasury Committee that if the BBRS are telling you that everything was done in full agreement with all the SMEs, they were all represented, and we always did what the SMEs and their representatives wanted us to do, that would be a contestable point. Another one here, has the BBRS handled evidence of criminality in the correct manner? The point is that amongst the evidence given to the BBRS, is there evidence of criminality by the banks? And if there has been, have they done the right thing with that evidence of criminality? For example, have they reported it to the police? And if not, why haven't they? It's a very specific, very important point. There's a conclusion, the next steps bit, and as you can see here, well, as you might have seen, we were hoping that a Treasury Committee inquiry might be open. You have all very kindly listened patiently whilst I worked my way through that. To recap, I'm very, very keen now to understand any topics that you think are important that haven't yet been addressed in that document, because we can simply add new sections into it. And I'm very, very keen that we do as comprehensive a job as possible, as inclusively as possible, and that we, TTF, represent the views of TTF's members as best as we possibly can, right? And what we might well do at some point in this, is quite literally give everybody about 10 minutes or so of quiet time to think and reflect and write into the chat things that you want to talk about. So it's quite likely that everything you're about to say, I'm going to say to you afterwards. Thank you very much for that point. Please put a few words about that in the chat. It's going to help me to make sure I capture things that are important. I can see Ivan's got his hand up. Then we'll go to Ian Tyler. That's good. If you know how to use the electronic thing to raise your hand, please do, because it means I can see you more readily. So Richard Loxton, Ian Tyler, please raise your hands digitally whilst we first of all go to Ivan. And for the interest of others folk who might not know you, would you mind just very briefly just introducing yourself to give everybody a little bit of context, Ivan? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ivan Wilcock, former chartered town planner, victim of the IRHP fraud by the banks, 4 banks involved. I have a letter in front of me from my MP, which has obviously been written by her advisor and is declaring 2 things about the BBRS. First, it is independent, and secondly, it is free. Now, I'm going to use this session to put together the most succinct and damning couple of paragraphs I can deliver to this lady to try and get her to change her mind. My query really is, does everybody know that right now, today, somebody is telling all our MPs porkies about the BBRS?
Okay, so that's interesting. It gets incendiary pretty quickly around here, doesn't it? Brilliant. Thank you, Ivan. So I'd like to talk about what I've just spoken about in a broader context to begin with, okay? As I think some of you know, in August last summer, God, a year ago, the BBC broadcasted a programme about the Blackmore bond scandal. Some of you may have seen it. TTF was a little bit involved. And after that programme about the Blackmore bond scandal, many people had interactions with their MPs about the Blackmore bond scandal, and TTIP was quite kind of involved in that activity. And what we basically found was the MPs replied back, depending on where they were on the political spectrum, and we're not going to get party political, but depending on where they were on the political spectrum, they sometimes produced what looked like a piece of standard copy that we had reason to believe came from the Treasury. Yeah, so the MP would have written to the Treasury, had this inquiry from my constituent, what's the answer, please? Now we've got that information, and then sent it out to the constituent. And once we kind of figured what was going on, we started challenging the narrative that was being put out. And over a period of about 6 months, and if Paul Kiley was with us, I don't know if he is, if Paul Kiley was with us, he could talk at length about this. The narrative changed because more and more of what had been put out, we had successfully challenged to show that it wasn't actually all that accurate. I'm using very polite language. It wasn't all that accurate. So what you're talking about there, Ivan, is a very similar thing where an MP has probably been given a piece of standard text that basically talks about the generic characteristics of the BBRS as being free and independent and so on and so forth. Just in the last couple of days, there's been a bit of dialogue amongst some of us about responding to those sorts of letters to challenge them exactly what they mean by independent, exactly what do they mean by fair. And we can circulate that information and enable people to have it so that they can push back at their MP if their MP simply provides a copy-paste narrative provided by the Treasury. Okay. I think the question of the BBRS's independence is massively important, so it's good of you to raise it. Ivan, is that okay if we move on from there? Have you touched on it okay?
Absolutely fine, thank you, Andy.
You're most welcome, sir. Thank you very much. We're going to go to Mr. Ian Tyler, then to Stephen Barker, and then to Richard Loxton. So, Mr. Ian Tyler, please do. Oh, forgive me, there's one bit in. Ivan, do me a favour, write something in the chat that just relates to what you just spoke about, because it will help me to kind of process after the event. Okay, thank you, Ivan. Thank you, okay. Mr. Ian Tyler. Thank you.
I guess because I can't stay to the end, so I wanted to get a couple of points out. Please do. But I guess my counsel to you, Andy, would be that I don't think we should just be focusing on BBRS. I mean, because to be quite frank, it's so obviously a complete. I think the banks have actually been too successful, so that it actually is so obviously a failure that actually you can almost skim read a couple of pages and immediately realize the banks, completely diddled the way it was set up, compromised the governance. It was never truly independent of the banks, and thus it was set up to fail. And let's be honest, all the data that we've got and the whistleblowers data adds to that, proves that it has failed. So there's a complete disconnect between what the aims were and what UK Finance said they were signing up to and what's actually been achieved. End of. BBRS is a complete and utter phase, and actually has just increased the distrust that we all have with the banks. So you don't need to write that. I could write that in 2 pages, so to me, the bigger thing is, it's not just about the BBRS. There is dispute resolution is completely failing for SMEs. It's the whole subject of dispute resolution. So you need to look at the FCA. What's the role of the FCA? Well, they've actually got statutory powers, as Stephen will tell you, but they do damn nothing. They always sidestep any individual complaints. They say it's not our duty to deal with it. In practice, they are interested because they're using it for market intelligence, but they try to avoid getting their hands dirty. So the FCA are a waste of time. FOS, I actually am not the expert on FOS, but everybody tells me that FOS is, incompetent and not very able to make informed decisions, etc., etc. BBRS, fundamentally, and the only other option we've got left is the courts, which most SMEs simply can't afford. So we need to actually set out all that choice and say none of these work for SME. So we need to have a better solution, and then we should propose something that we believe is a better solution. So to me, I think what I'm really trying to say is we need to be a bit more strategic in the way that we approach this. It's an opportunity to actually propose what we would like and to give the bigger strategic picture rather than just focus on BBRS, which we could spend all night just talking about the failings of the BBRS, but actually, I mean, you know, I hope some people's reputations will be destroyed by this, but ultimately, you know, that doesn't help any SME get more money, if you know what I mean.
It's quite bizarre, Ian, because the next speaker, Stephen Barker, and I think he'll have a thing or two to say in congruence with what you just set out. Thank you, Ian. I absolutely buy into what you just said.
Okay, good. And I'll shut up now then.
No. It's very, 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 very valuable. The reason I'm showing this is because here's a list that was in the Transparency Times. There's a bit here about was the BBRS right to close down the SME liaison panel. That's not all that significant, but there is a really significant bit, which is the way forward. Why giving an expanded remit to the Financial Ombudsman Service would be a disaster, and why the banks prefer that option. The reason we think that's what they would prefer is because that's what the government's proposing. We know that that's what the government's proposing because that's what the Economic Secretary to the Treasury said he thought the government should do at the end of the Westminster Hall debate a couple of weeks ago. And then the next bit is about the merits of independent tribunals. So there's definitely going to be something in there, Ian, about we are where we are. It's been a complete dog's dinner. Let's learn fully what's wrong with it, including the process that led to it being wrong, which many people would argue ineffective representation of SMEs for all kinds of reasons. And then let's go to town on what good solutions might look like, including things like tribunals. So Ian, thank you very much indeed. And if you don't mind, sir, could I please invite you just to put a sentence or two in the chat to remind me to kind of link in the points you just made so eloquently and that I fully agree with. Thank you, Ian, very, very much. Mr. Stephen Barker, what would you like to share at this point?
I'm just going to stand on the shoulders of Ian, of course. The reality is that the current system has failed at all levels. That's the system of restitution and regulation. The issue, though, for politicians, I believe, is not a lack of sympathy towards people like ourselves. Simply, they do not know how to deal with it. They're not going to be able to get together and work out a comprehensive, as Ian said, strategic plan as to how it can be dealt with. In a sense, that's not really what politicians do. They wait for their civil servants to work out the plan, and then they analyse it and question it, and eventually we get a piece of legislation. So our task and opportunity here is undoubtedly to influence the future, rather than get any kind of satisfaction out of proving the past was a failure. And so the big question is, we understand there is a certain momentum to push SMEs towards an enlarged FOS. We think that is strategically entirely the wrong answer. FOS may do okay in some respects, but we're uncomfortable about the number of bankers that exist in FOS. We're uncomfortable about how it goes about collecting evidence. There's no opportunity to cross-examine people. It is very much throwing your hat in the ring, and maybe the FOS will come up with a decision that is somehow in your favour, and maybe a small award will be granted to you. But that's not what we're talking about for most people on this particular call. So what's always troubled me about this right from the beginning is that we create this very powerful regulator, and it is a powerful regulator, a power to regulate these major institutions within our economy, and we just leave it to them. Would those institutions actually like to be regulated in that way? Could that regulator behave unfairly towards them? So the Act in 2000 created a tribunal system. And the only people who have access to the tribunal system are the regulated entities. not the consumers. None of us automatically have access to that tribunal system. But if you're a bank employee or indeed a bank, you have access to the tribunal. And it's run by the Lord Chancellor's Department. It's entirely independent. It's part of the judicial system. Evidence is presented in the way it would be presented in a court. People are, there are hearings, not necessarily every time. It depends on the nature of the reference. People are able to be cross-examined, and you get a judicial view and decision on your case. And there's no charges for this. There's no charge for making a referral. And so long as you conduct yourself properly during the course of the process, there's no charge or costs awarded against you should your reference not be accepted by the tribunal. Now, this is very, very important, because if we look at the history of claims made by SMEs following receipt of, no doubt, highly qualified legal advice, it's been pitiful, the outcome, and the cost to certain individuals has just been life-destroying. So, going forward, the question of what we need is we need access to an established tribunal system. We don't need to create a new one. We just need access to it. And that access should be on the same basis that it's currently available to employees of banks and other financial institutions who may be approved persons or a regulated entity. We want the same access, and we want our complaints to be heard in that kind of a forum. Now, there'll be a screening process, of course, to exclude, shall we say, the unbalanced, etc. But we want access. And at the moment, we do not have that access. Now, I'll caveat that by just saying, by way of encouragement to those people who are on this call, who have suffered a grievous loss as a result of mis-selling of interest rate hedging products as a generic term for derivatives, a regulated activity. The decision to exclude us from the voluntary redress scheme in 2012 was a decision of the Financial Conduct Authority. Okay? Therefore, because it was a decision of the Financial Conduct Authority acting as the competence authority, and that impacted on me and, well, it's thought to be about 5,000 others, that is something that we have access to the financial tribunal for, because it's a direct decision of the Financial Conduct Authority. I can't make a complaint to the I cannot make a reference to the tribunal about a dispute between me and Lloyds Bank. That's not what the tribunal's there for. But the tribunal is there for the conduct of the regulator. So for those of us in that group, I suddenly see a chink of light that indeed we may have access to the tribunal on the basic terms that I've outlined. But with regard to the wider issue of future regulation, that undoubtedly should be available to anybody if they have a dispute with a regulated firm or a regulated person, because there are people wandering about financial services that describe themselves as FCA approved, as a statement of some kind of authority and integrity and honesty. And if the reality is they're not have those qualities, you ought to be able to gain access to a suitable forum to have that heard and a decision made. So in this letter to MPs, I think we have to focus on what's available now, how it's come about historically in terms of the legislation, why it was created, why it was thought necessary in the interest of fairness. And if it was thought necessary in the interest of fairness for organisations and people who have, according to those who've done the research, have been fined repeatedly, substantially for irregular activity, but in fairness should have access to an independent tribunal, then I think consumers of those same people should also have access to the same tribunal in the interest of fairness.
Absolutely, absolutely, Stephen.
So that's really strategically, to go back to Ian, I think we have to lay out what MPs can do and the reasons behind why it should be done. That's what I want to say.
Fantastic. I think I'll remember for a very, very long time the telephone conversation I had with Stephen last week, where he brought me up to speed with what he discovered around the Financial Services Markets Tribunal. It was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Stephen, if you're happy to, perhaps you'd be happy to put some links into the chat that will take people to what you found and where you found it, because despite the fact that I've been in the financial services sector since 1986, and I must have had hundreds of conversations around these sorts of issues over recent years, until Stephen made me aware of it last week, I literally did not know about the Financial Services and Markets Tribunal. And it does look as though it's an existing tribunal mechanism that could work, which negates all these arguments about we don't want to spend money setting up a new tribunal system. Why don't we just use the FOS? It's a huge piece of information. In fact, so much so, folks, can we please put our hands together for Mr. Stephen Barker for discovering what he discovered last week? Because I think, and I think Stephen thinks, it could potentially be ultra, ultra significant. Stephen, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be really, really keen to hear from anybody that knows anything about the Financial Services and Markets Tribunal that Stephen putting a link to in the chat. So, well, thanks, Stephen. Superb input, sir. Thank you as always. Toby, please take a moment to introduce yourself and then share with us your thoughts, Toby. Thank you. And if you don't mind, and you may mind, but if you don't mind, please do tell us a little bit about your cases very, very briefly. I really want people to understand what your circumstances have been, Toby. Go for it, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Toby Chambers, and my claim actually dates back before everything, back to 2002-03, where I started to get some finance, and my health failed as well, and I had insurance policies that were acquired, and they haven't paid out. And so anyway, one thing that I would like to pick up that is sort of underpins a lot of this is the conflict of interest that the current Prime Minister, when he was with the Children Investment Fund and with Chris Hon, because that deal back in 2008, actually, there hasn't been any scrutiny. I mean, he obviously, I think, you know, the public domain says he wasn't involved in any of the kind of ABM, Embro, RBS deal, but that needs to be held to account in terms of we wouldn't be in this mess, particularly with kind of NatWest RBS, if that deal hadn't gone through. And you know, that part of that underpins why RBS was in such a mess, because they got out knowing full well that there was ABN Embro was in dire straits. And then we're left with, you know, picking up the pieces to try and make our own claim. So, you know, from a political standpoint, that I haven't, while it's not quite the remit of the business banking, but I think from a political point of view, he needs to be far more scrutinised over what he knew at that time.
Toby, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Very, very much appreciated. It was lovely to meet you. Was it the week before last on Zoom? Thank you. Very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Sinead, I'm guessing how to pronounce Sinead's name. I might be getting it wrong, but she knows there's some eye contact there. Sinead, you wrote this in the chat. You said, I can share about the FS Tribunal. Sinead, please tell us what you can share about the FS Tribunal.
Okay. Just so you know, it's pronounced Shona, but it's really hard. So don't worry, nobody ever gets it right. So I am actually one of those people. I'm certified. I was originally an approved person, but now in most of firms, you're not approved by the FCA anymore. You're certified by your peers. But I can share a couple of experiences I've had, not personally, but people that the FCA has not wanted to approve for various things they might have done or not done in the eyes of the FCA. And when they go to the Financial Services Tribunal to get themselves exonerated, and most people are not sponsored by their firms, but they have to go independently if the FCA won't approve them. And it costs them, it does cost them money. So I'm not quite sure whether the idea it doesn't. But the actual people that work in financial services feel that the tribunal's not fair. So just be very careful, because there are people on the tribunal that sit on it who are senior people of the FCA. And if you've been dumbed down as an FCA person by the FCA, then you go to the tribunal, they're not independent. So about 2 years ago, I think it was, people within the industry said that there wasn't enough independence of the tribunal over the FCA. There's too many people from the FCA in the tribunal. So all I'd say is, don't think that the tribunal is the perfect solution, because I think they've got conflicts and they're not truly independent. That's my thesis.
I think what you just said is remarkably helpful. It really is remarkably helpful. Would you be happy for me to connect you with Stephen Barker, the gentleman that just spoke, on this? Because it might be you've got other insights you could share with each other, because frankly, you're pricelessly valuable right now, because you're the only person I've ever spoken to other than Stephen Barker who knows anything about this. And if your perception is it may not be all that fair because the FCA is trawling all over it, and that's really useful information, because we could reference the idea that the adjudication in the tribunal needs to be fair, and therefore
it needs to be independent from the FCA.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people feel internally in regulated firms, the tribunal is not fully independent, therefore why bother? So if you are kind of cast out by the FCA, as in not quite the squeaky person they think you are, and some of the past histories of people I know aren't that bad, you know. They've done whatever they did wrong, and now, you know, they're cast to the side. It's ruined people's careers. I mean, literally ruined them.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased you've come along for the session, and I'll make a point to introduce you to Stephen Barker by email. Is that okay with you, Stephen? I'm sure the answer is yes, but just as a courtesy, I'm asking you, I've got a sort of thumbs up on the idea of you speaking to Sinead in due course. Thank you, Stephen, very, very much. Wonderful. Okay, so it's just gone 7 o'clock. We'll be wrapping up in roughly half an hour. The question I'd like you to all think about is, if there was only one thing, and you're going to be putting this into the chat, okay? If there was only one thing that you thought TTF should definitely include in our submission to the Treasury inquiry about SME finance and the BBRS, etc., what would that one thing be? What is the one thing that really matters to you? Because I want to make sure that whatever it is that really matters to you, we have a chance of including it. We'll give ourselves 5 minutes of quiet time for this. Go and make a cup of tea if you want to. We'll come back to this at about 7:05. And once you've worked out whatever it is, the thing that you want to put as your priority, please write it in the chat. That way, I'm going to make sure that I don't. That way, I'm going to make sure that I don't miss anything that matters to you. So I'm going to now turn off my microphone, and I'm going to turn off my camera. Reconvene in roughly 5 minutes. Use it to stretch your legs, make yourself a cup of tea, and please write down the thing that matters to you more than anything else that we should include in our submission in the chat. Okay, and I'll be coming back up for air, so to speak, in about 5 minutes, folks. It's a bit like primary school when the teacher gave you quiet time to sit and draw. Okay, it's just gone 5 past, I think. So we'll reconvene now. I'm seeing what's in the chat with great interest here. I'm going to read out what Malcolm Brain put in the chat. In fact, Malcolm, after I've read it out, I'd love you to come to the mic, so to speak, and elaborate on why this matters to you so much, but you've expressed it really well, I thought. Malcolm says, we need a truly independent forum for banking complaints that is not directly paid for by the banks. It should also enable those that have gone through the BBRS or otherwise settled to have the settlement agreement unpicked by the forum. Mr. Malcolm Brain, I invite you, if you wish, to sort of take yourself off mute and elaborate on what life experience has led you to feel that that's particularly important to you. If you want to, Malcolm, you don't have to, but if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I went through the BBRS system and it was a long battle for about 2 years and got nowhere, basically. They couldn't adjudicate on half of the complaint points. They totally ignored evidence. And whatever the bank denied, they believed, even though Lloyds Bank this is and the Bank of Scotland formerly were corrupt, and all the rest of it we all know about HBOS Reading. So they totally ignored our evidence and simply believed what the bank told them. So that was a complete waste of time. And then we're left in the position where, do we battle through the courts? Can we afford that? I may or may not be speaking personally here because there's certain things that I shouldn't say.
Sure.
But it leaves us with a battle, potentially, me or any other customers and victims, where if we can't afford to go through the courts, we may be forced to settle with a bank under a personal guarantee or similar. And then we need the ability, after the bank may have to pay for this tribunal or whatever system indirectly, but certainly not directly, because as we found with the BBRS, they are corrupt and they are running the BBRS. So we need them to pay, but indirectly, whether it be run by the government or whoever. Then we need that ability, not only to have the complaint reheard, but to be able to unpick any agreement that a victim has had to deal with previously in any settlement agreement. We need the ability to unpick that. Because of the failure of the BBRS, we're all left between a rock and a hard place if they have failed us, which is certainly in my case.
Yeah. So these are my words, not yours. You're saying that there's effectively unfinished business that still needs to be resolved because the BBRS didn't work for you. So this other mechanism needs to be able to pick up sort of half-baked cases, as it were, and sort them out and finalise them. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Or even where it has supposedly been finalised, some victims are not going to be happy still.
Yes. Malcolm, thank you very much. That was crystal clear. Forgive me, I didn't mean to accidentally cut across you just then. Carry on, please do.
What was I going to add? Yeah, because some people, and I know of other victims, where they've had to settle with the bank to keep it out of court or potentially lose their home through court, not being able to proceed through court. And then they're left in the position of, do they claim? Can they afford to claim? Can any settlement agreement be unpicked and any money paid to the bank? In that case, can that be returned? There's all those sorts of things so that we can go on further.
I'm with it. That's really clear, Malcolm. Thank you. You spoke about those thoughts very clearly and you wrote them very clearly as well. I'm very, very grateful to you, Malcolm. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks.
I'm going to read out what Joan Finch has written. And if Joan wants to, she can elaborate them. Doesn't have to, but Joan, you can if you wish. So Joan Finch has written, ensure that the banks and the Treasury have absolutely no control over any other future resolution service. Independent must mean independent. Thank you, Joan. Couldn't be clearer. Would you like to speak to that point and why that matters so much to you? You don't have to, but it's an option if you'd like to.
Well, obviously, I think everyone will probably agree with me on that. It makes a lot of sense because we've been the victims, bank victims, have been completely misled by everybody really over this BBRS. And I was present at the SME Alliance meeting in Conway Hall, which I think was October 2019, when Lewis Shan Smith was there and giving us a lot of hope. that we would finally get the justice that we deserved. In fact, I remember my husband had a word with him, and he knew about our case. I know that for a fact. And my husband said, you know, you have a lot of responsibility resting on your shoulders. And he said, yes, I know. And I think, yes, he probably is a decent guy. I really don't know where it all went wrong. And surely he should have resigned a long time ago over the BBRS, but I don't want to dwell on that. I know from my family's own experiences, it is absolutely no good going to the courts. We did it foolishly because I suppose as older people, you believe that there is justice in the British judiciary service, but believe me, there isn't. Not when you're up against the banks. Yeah. Because the banks and their legal teams, they don't think twice about making statements that are untrue. They're quite happy to perjure themselves if necessary. And the judges virtually always side with the banks. Because I think in our own case, the relationship manager had worked for Lloyds Bank for 25 years or something like that. And so the judge couldn't see how a man who'd worked for the bank for 25 years could possibly not be telling the truth. And how could he possibly have done any wrong in the whole affair? Sorry, I've gone on a bit, but.
No, you spoke your mind, Joan, and it's great when people have a chance to do that. And I really, really hope that the attempts we make to try to create a safe environment where people can speak freely and honestly is valued. I certainly value the chance to try to facilitate that. Joan, thank you very, very much. I can absolutely 100% see why anybody who went through the BBRS process would frankly hate the idea of the next iteration of it, or whatever it's going to be, is in any way under, behind closed doors influence from other parties. I can absolutely buy into that. Thank you very much indeed, Joan. There's a few other thoughts, folks, here from people. Mr. Scott Henderson, if you wish, you don't have to, Scott, but if you want to, please take a moment to bring the point you put into the chat to life, if you wish to, Scott.
Hi, Andy. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, also just picked up on what Malcolm said there about the nobody can afford to go to court, and as Joan had mentioned, it's maybe not worth going anyway. But yeah, you mentioned earlier on about the criminality aspects. I know we've spoken a little bit about our case. I think that's very important to take forward, because the BBRS, certainly in our case, didn't put anything forward to any relevant authority, and I haven't heard of anybody else that was put forward that had criminality within their case that was presented to the BBRS. So that's maybe a thing to highlight.
Thank you very much indeed, Scott. Thank you. Good to see you here, Scott, and also Norma. Hi, Norma. I'm going to invite Toby to talk about Clause 8 of the BBRS release letter. This is news to me. Would you mind, Toby, just telling everybody a bit more about Clause 8 of the BBRS release letter?
Yeah, like my company, like was about 2014. I'd been through the process and eventually could see I was not getting anywhere, and I was also having some health problems, and eventually let the company kind of just be dissolved. Luckily for me, I paid off all what I owed the bank. And that was one priority for me, was making sure that I paid everything back, every penny they claimed from me back. Then I went back to them and started to try and get some compensation. I did actually get a little bit through the Financial Ombudsman Service, but that didn't settle my big thing, which is my insurance issue on my health. Then when I I did put a thing into the Companies House about a couple of weeks before the 6-year period to restore my company back onto the register. And at that time, there was kind of like a little bit of argy-bargy. So it didn't actually technically get restored, but I just left that in limbo and then went to the BBRS. And then this is one big issue when you haven't got a company restored. The technical issue is actually it's not in existence.
Yeah.
And so they require you to sign kind of a waiver letter. And it's so biased that actually, you know, if they do something wrong, if you sign it, and I refused to sign it because I could see if I signed it and then long term, if I restored the company, I wouldn't have any ability to do anything. And that was one of their original objectives, why they weren't going to do anything about my claim, because the company, first of all, wasn't restored to the register. And secondly, I refused to sign their waiver letter that is so biased on their side of things. I said, look, I want a couple of clauses so that if all of a sudden, you know, you've done something, you know, if we find there's some criminality behind the bank, what they did to me, for example, when they shouldn't have kind of they particularly on this insurance issue, then I wouldn't have any claim anyway. I couldn't even go to a court to say, look, there is some criminal evidence here because I've signed my life away on that waiver.
Wow.
So it is something that you know, at the time I was kind of flabbergasted when I was asked to sign this, but I can now, being involved in this as well, you know, there's so many other issues that, you know, the whole scheme is just, you know, at the time I thought in good faith, okay, this sounds like a good way of getting everyone settled, and you know, I was just aghast really that it was just so one-sided, and you know, this is on a second point, restoring companies. You know, there needs to be a first point of call with even Companies House, from my mind, to just help this process. They themselves are registered with Companies House. You know, and this is where it becomes a bit of a massive problem for you know, someone in my situation to get a company restored, to start even the process.
Toby, thank you so much for explaining that. I've learned quite a bit there. I really have learned quite a bit. I did not realise you effectively had to sort of sign away rights and sign away power. Toby, thank you for explaining that. In a moment, I'm going to ask Tony Barron to share his thoughts and elaborate what Tony Barron put in the chat, if Tony Barron would like to. Before I do, I just want to sort of share a very straightforward idea. In my experience, talking to lots of people about the BBRS over the last couple of years, there are kind of two groups. There's one group that believes that there was really good intent behind the BBRS to begin with, and something went horribly wrong at some point in time and it got off the rails. There's a lot of people who think that. There's other people who think, actually, no, it's worse than that. They all did what they needed to do to make it look like there was genuine intent to make it all go right. But in actual fact, BBRS was always intended, from our point of view, to be a complete failure. From their point of view, a complete success. Ian Tyler made a point earlier, you probably picked up on it. The banks have been so successful. They've been too successful in causing the BBRS to pay out hardly any money at all. So much so that it's very obvious to lots of people that it really has not worked. Just general thoughts there. You know, which of those two camps are you in? I'm not looking for an answer. Do you believe the BBRS was genuine to begin with and it went horribly wrong? Or do you think the whole thing was gained from the off with deception and cloak and dagger and mirrors and all the rest of it? Mr. Tony Barron, would you like to share with us an elaboration of why you put what you put in the chat, Tony? Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. If I may, I'll start slightly differently than what was in the chat.
Okay, sure.
That is that I believe that the key to what we're talking about is cultural change. We can try and set up different bodies
to deliver justice where there is a massive imbalance between the power of the banks and their ability to hire the best lawyers, etc., versus SMEs. So how do you get the cultural change? And I think the key word is one that you use a lot, Andy, and that's transparency. We need information. I'll give you an example of something that happened to one of my committee members only yesterday. She had her bank accounts frozen, so she couldn't pay salaries, couldn't pay bills, couldn't pay anything because they didn't understand her business. Very foolishly, the people who were doing that actually don't understand anything about business at all, because they closed the account on an insolvency practitioner, a professional lawyer. So she immediately issued a statutory demand for access to her money with the threat of a winding up order against the bank if they hadn't paid up in 21 days. But this is happening all over the shop with SMEs. It is not just mis-selling of product, it is arbitrary behavior on a widespread scene across the entire country, across the entire financial system. So my view is that we need to insist that, for example, where banks are closing accounts, that the reasons for those closures and the geography of the individuals, of the SMEs, whether they're female, their ethnicity, their location, is all provided to the FCA, and then that information has to be published and be in the public domain for everyone to look at. The same with where banks are closing businesses down. We need to have that publicized and the reasons given, and we need to have clearly then mechanisms for redress. Practically, I doubt that we are going to remove POS, though I think everybody accepts that they are not fit for purpose at the moment. They have not been fit for purpose with regard to the SMEs for a long time. But we need to get their procedures much more transparent, with the individual complainants being able to see what is being said by the other side. At the moment, you don't see what the bank is saying about you, so you have no ability to challenge the misrepresentations that are made. But then you need an appeals mechanism, and you have to have an independent tribunal. I agree with everything that's gone before, that it cannot be paid directly by the banks. There has to be a levy on the lenders, but that's collected by the government, and the tribunal set up with independence. Now, the problem that we heard earlier about, oh, well, the bank officials must be credible, and you as an SME isn't credible. The only thing that you can do with that is access to the data and everything out in the open. So transparency, I think, is the absolute key here, and constant pushing for basic justice. But from my point of view, we need to reform FOS, but we also need the tribunal system set up for appeals and for the larger, much more complex cases, because it's clear that the individuals who operate at FOS just basically tell them, just do what the banks tell them.
Tony, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I'm genuinely not wanting to put you on the spot here, and feel free to sidestep the question, okay? But is the idea of a fair, equitable, transparent system for redress between businesses and banks, is the idea of that something that's sufficiently important to the Federation of Small Business for the FSB to, for want of a better phrase, take some kind of a stand on it. You know, take a position that we need and want a fair redress mechanism to settle disputes between businesses and banks, and we're going to kick up about it until we get it. Is the FSB minded to do that? What are you showing me, sir? Please tell us. Thank you.
FSB submission for Treasury Committee inquiry into SME access to finance. Right? And you don't have access to finance unless you've got a bank account. So you've got to start from the very beginning, which is what I've done in here, which is to say, you've got the unbanked, the debanked need to have access to the banking system for a start, because they can, when the bank threatens you by threatening to take your bank account away, right, your business dies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? And everybody who has got a business knows full well they do not want to go around and say, well, I'm terribly sorry, give me a few days. I've had a problem with my bank. They've closed my account.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it starts from you've got to start from the bottom up. It's pervasive through the system, is in my view.
Thank you very much indeed. I really hadn't given any thought to the sort of cultural dynamic that you've brought into this conversation, but you're absolutely right, aren't you? Because there needs to be a culture within the system that actually wants things to be fair and equitable and equal, you know, not a terrible asymmetry of one side being very powerful and another side being very weak. And there does need to be more transparency. Thank you very much indeed, Tony. Thank you very, very much indeed. We've got time for one or two other comments before we start bringing matters to a close. For me personally, by the way, folks, this has been a remarkably helpful conversation, and I promise you I'll do all I can to try to feed in all these thoughts into our submission. And remember what I said earlier, for those of you that want access to the document, the live document that we'll be working on, you'll have that access if you want it, and feel free to nab bits out of it and put it into your own responses as well. If you want to do that, why not do it? So please raise your hand if you'd like to come in with any sort of closing comments before I start to bring the conversation to a close. Mr. Richard Loxton, please, to you, sir. Thank you.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Richard.
Right, jolly good. Yes, no, I've had problems in the past. Now, I believe that all of my comments will be consistent with what everyone said before.
Okay.
I've approached the situation from a completely different angle. I was never involved with the BBRS, but I was technically a director of an SME, and I've had elements of my case heard by the property tribunal. So people have been talking about property law, and I have an element of expertise there. I've had elements of my expertise, my problem resolved by the General Regulatory Chamber, which is to do with information technology. Okay. And what I think is a massive issue, which people have sort of talked around, is that fraud is very easy to commit. It's very difficult to prove. So I was definitely a victim of property-related fraud.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the legal profession is not capable currently of dealing with property-related fraud and IT technology-related fraud. I'm aware that I'm required and I can produce evidence that proves that lawyers are not capable of dealing with the IT technology. Some of the issues, I took a case right up to the upper tribunal to do with administrative affairs. So that is right up to the top level you can go. Now, I lost on a technicality, which I won't go into because it's too boring, but I lost on a technicality. But that technicality proves how incompetent, and I'm using the word incompetent because members of the public cannot make a judgment of negligence. Only judges can make a judgment of negligence. Lawyers cannot make a judgment of negligence, only if they're appointed to be a judge. You must be a judge sitting in a judicial environment, which could be a tribunal, it could be a court of law, but only a judge, and the judge may not be a lawyer. There are lay members of tribunals who can make judicial decisions which says this person, who may be a director of the Financial Conduct Authority or whatever, has been negligent. Now that's hugely difficult to prove. All the speakers have identified how different that is. But what I believe I do have, and I've sent you, Andy, in the TTF email saying, right, these are links where I can prove that there is institutionalized discrimination against private individuals, because as other spayers have said, it's no good going to the courts because one judge, one lawyer will automatically support another lawyer. So the lawyer can tell as many lies as they like and they will get away with it.
Richard, thank you for making your point. I need to cut it there so we can squeeze it.
That's fine, that's fine. Yep.
Thank you, Richard. We're then going to go to Hubert. Hubert, forgive me, I didn't see that you were waving around, but other people told me in the chat that you were. And after Hubert, we're going to go to Mr. Bill Burton. Okay, so Hubert, over to you, sir. Please as succinct as you can. Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much, Andy. Andy, I can probably speak on behalf of virtually everyone that has spoken tonight. Toby, I've been through the same route as the waiver nonsense. I tried to get around it. I couldn't. I had to go through it. I went through the BBRS, an absolute shambles. The people in it that I had my affair with, they don't belong where they are. First of all, Danske Bank dropped the hammer on me on a very successful property development, left me totally stranded, and things went downhill from there. I went to FOSS, I complained to them, cut a long story short, took them a year to tell me that actually they didn't handle cases like mine because I was made insolvent. Now, I have an email from Andrew Bailey in my hand, I can cover it to anybody, where Andrew Bailey is responding to my MP, and in it, it's obviously an email to the CEO of Danske Bank in Belfast, and he is asking that CEO, who I met personally in his boardroom, to put my case after protesting on the streets of Northern Ireland and the Open Golf Championships. All of that I can take you through. I was offered by the CEO of Danske Bank a tribunal type of thing, concocted from various models. And I was also told by him that the BBRS would never get off the ground. At that particular point in time, I was very, very nervous about what was going to happen. If I didn't get the BBRS, would I be in trouble? I took his offer, stupid me. The bank paid for an independent arbitration. I lost that. When I saw the results come back, Richard Loxton has just encapsulated the entire experience that I had. Liars, liars, and more liars. And that went on. I then took it to the BBRS. The BBRS did exactly the same thing. I would support anybody that can kick the BBRS out of the system totally. Now, the Andrew Bailey, in his email to my MP and to Danske Bank, asked for very pertinent questions. And at the time that they dropped the hammer on me, I took ill. And in my conversations with FOSS, Andrew Bailey was able, in his email to Danske Bank, was able to say, my staff needed better training in who they were dealing with, because it was clear that I was a vulnerable adult and they should have treated me different. And not only that, but they couldn't deal with me at all because Danske Bank had made me insolvent in the first instance, which gave them time to do the rest of what they were doing. I have currently in my possession details, data, letters that show that Danske Bank were lying. But worse than that, I also can prove what I'm doing.
Yeah, I understand. Hubert, I'm going to have to stop you there. Hubert, I'm going to have to stop you there only because I need to manage
Yes, thank you, Andy.
together. But thank you very much indeed for setting out what you have just explained. It's very, very powerful stuff. We're going to go back to Bill Burton now. So Bill, thank you very much for allowing me to put Hubert in front of you, because Hubert was kind of like next one in the queue. So Bill Burton, please do take yourself off mute and share your thoughts. Thank you. Where's Bill Burton gone? Bill is, it looks like he's away from his desk now. Does anybody else want to come in whilst we're waiting for Bill to return? Otherwise, we'll start bringing the conversation to a close. Mr. Ian Stocks, and Ian, I need you to be succinct. So give me the succinct version of whatever it is you're about to say. Go for it.
Can we submit our evidence to you for a first look at?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'll take that as a compliment. I think the answer is yes, for two reasons. First of all, if you say anything that's half decent, I might copy paste it and use it in ours. That's one reason. And secondly, because I would be delighted to help in some way. But yeah, but please do, Ian. The same applies to anybody else. Okay, if you want to send your thoughts to me before we submit it, then I'll be glad to try to help. Thank you. Cheers, Ian. And that was really succinct. Very good, Mr. Bill Burton. We're waiting for you to say what you'd like to say now, sir. Over to you, Bill. It's all yours, but please be as succinct for me as you can, because we're running a little bit over time now. Thank you.
Okay, Bill. I'm back here now, yeah? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, well, I've read the banking thing, and what I can't understand is how the banks got away with it. And the government...
What a good question.
The government just support it. It's unbelievable. I mean, Andy, you're doing a fantastic job, mate. Fantastic job. And I will stick with you as long as I can to try and support what you're doing, because we are being ripped off by all these banks and all these finance companies. It's just disgusting. Anyway, Andy, I thank you for doing this, and you're great. And I'm going to stay with this. Okay, thank you, Andy.
That's made my day, Bill. That really has made my day. That's so straightforward language. I get it. Thank you very much. By the way, does anybody have any theories? How have the banks got away with it? Please put your comments in the chat or bring them to life verbally if you wish. Folks, we're kind of going...
envelopes.
Say again.
Brown envelopes.
Maybe.
Oh, they're too mean.
Folks, we've kind of gone over schedule, all right? So I'm going to kind of formally close the session there, all right? But I'm happy to carry on. If you're happy to carry on, then please do. We're going to go to Mr. Scott Henderson next. We're still recording, by the way, so we're still going to publish whatever gets said, but just formally speaking, that's kind of the end of the meeting. Mr. Scott Henderson, please do share your thoughts. Thank you.
Just a question out there. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk tonight about failures of redress schemes, lawyers, judges, etc. What do other countries have in position for this? And should we be looking at other countries and saying, you know, can you come across and have a look at like a tribunal system for a select number of, well, for instance, there's 30 odd people here tonight. Have a look at that and see their thoughts. Just present evidence.
You know what? That's such a remarkably good idea. It's such a remarkably good idea. Allow me to answer it as best as I can. Because TCF has got members all over the world in 21 countries, there's a whole bunch of people we know in Australia, and some of them are really, really good people, particularly people like Professor Nicholas Morris, Dr. Andy Shmulo, and others. And Andy Shmulo, Dr. Shmulo, I should say, was involved in helping to develop an idea in Australia. In Australia, they had a Royal Commission, which was like a massive inquiry into the banking and financial sector. And one of the outputs of that Royal Commission was a heavy-duty, hardcore oversight body that would scrutinise the regulator. And Dr. Schmuller would say, if he were here, I know his opinions pretty well, he would say that you need something regulating the regulator that's completely independent and completely hardwired to consumer interests, to scrutinise what they're doing and to prevent the lobbying of the industry from creating revolving door issues and regulatory capture issues. So I would say, and in fact it's something TTS has been campaigning for, that we need to have a proper oversight mechanism for the FCA. There's a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability, a lack of oversight, a lack of challenge. And because of the Financial Services and Markets Act, as it is now, it was a bill until quite recently, there are going to be even more panels from the industry represented with the FCA, but no further consumer representation. So to my mind, Scott, we have a completely kind of out of balance system. The financial sector gets really good representation, lots and lots of engagement with the FCA, and then consumer groups like us, can't get a word in edgeways. So there needs to be something to balance that out. In Australia, they've got this oversight body that I just spoke about. In America, they've got something called the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that is exclusively dedicated to representing consumer interests. I can see you, Ivan, or he's waving goodbye. And in Europe, in mainland Europe, they've got something called Better Finance, which is a state-funded consumer representative group. So I would say we need much better consumer representation paid for by the state so it can be done properly. And that's the kind of thing that comes to mind. Thank you, Scott. We've got time for maybe one or two more quick comments before we do wrap things up. Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to say? And I want to thank you all again for your participation and input. I think Hubert wants to come in there. Hubert, do you?
Yeah, please, just for a second, Andy. If anyone wants to know anything about my history, Heather Buchanan and Leslie Sheriff did a case study for Westminster, circulated on the 3rd of December 2019, and that went to every MP. It was a total breakdown and story of how Danske Bank scammed me, and my MP is recorded on Hansard speaking on my behalf and my company's behalf, and he was pretty vicious when he let go. And the Speaker of the House actually commented on how strong his language was, because he was normally known as a fairly quiet individual. But it's all there, it's all recorded, it's very clear just what the BBRS got up to. But that was the APPG that actually was tasked with the job of setting up the BBRS. And that was before that happened. So you can see what has happened. Even the APPG, who had a number of very able people putting forward their ideas and all the rest of it, and the BBRS was a consequence. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Hubert. Thank you very, very much. Okay, allow me to briefly recap. We are going to be putting our own submission in. We encourage everybody else to do the same. We'll circulate all the relevant links in the notes that get put around tomorrow. The recording is going to be available. I'll go through it to forensically try to make sure that all these points are incorporated in some way. We'll do as good a job as we can to represent the true interests of SMEs and to try to encourage a fair, equitable, transparent, morally correct and just system. That's what we all deserve, frankly. That's what we should all just take for granted. But it's a long way away from where we are now. And whilst I know many of you are walking your own rocky, windy, painful paths through a complete nightmare of one kind or another, all I can say is that the journey is better together than apart, and at least we can support each other and cheer each other up from time to time and give each other ideas and give each other information and just console ourselves that we're not the only ones in this horrible, horrible mess. Thanks all very much indeed for your participation and attendance tonight. Let's give ourselves a round of applause just to turning up and giving it a bit of a go. Yeah, thanks a lot, folks. Thank you very, very much indeed. And thanks for those very nice words that some of you have said. It's much appreciated. I'll tell the girls in the morning as well. Thanks, folks. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated.